In these two sessions, sessions 13 and 14, we're turning now to the issue of response. That is, how might we respond to the challenges of empire? We're thinking about this in two ways simultaneously, both in terms of mission and in terms of ethics. The two things may not be quite the same as each other, but I want to insist that they overlap considerably. The reason why they may not be entirely the same is because many Christians would want to argue that mission is primarily about proclaiming the good news of God's grace, which overrides any efforts to live ethically. In other words, at the very heart of the Christian gospel, there is the principle that we're not being commanded to be ethical, to be good, to achieve certain moral standards. Primarily, we're asked to trust ourselves to the goodness of God. And I'm not denying that God's grace is at the heart of Christian faith, but not many would want to say that that is the whole story. Rather, in the light of God's grace, we are being sanctified, we are being healed or made whole. That is, though growing in Christ-likeness is certainly not a precondition of God's grace coming to us, it's a response which flows from it. Out of God's grace flows the power for us to enact grace in the world, a world often lacking in grace. Not perfectly, but purposefully. Also, the widely adopted 5 marks of mission, which emerged first in the Anglican Communion and have been affirmed by many other church traditions now, specifically extends mission beyond the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom. The 5 marks include proclamation, nurturing believers, caring for people who are in need, transforming structures of injustice and violence, and treasuring the integrity of creation. So mission clearly entails questions of ethics. What does it mean to care for people in need, to transform structures of injustice and violence, and to treasure the integrity of creation? These are the sorts of issues we're working with here in these sessions in the light of the all-pervasive empire. That is to say, if empire is all around us and in our minds, what does it mean for us to respond missionally or ethically? How, in the light of God's grace, are we called to live differently? Of course, we could even ask, what does the emphasis on God's grace mean for us in the context of empire? An empire which is often not gracious at all. So grace is itself countercultural. And yet grace can be understood as allowing things to stay the same, because if God is gracious, even to defenders of empire, then why change anything? Even if that means that injustice, inequality, exclusion and scapegoating, as well as the destruction of the Earth's ecosystems, can continue forever and ever. But this is why it's important to affirm that the God of grace is not the God of empire. The God of grace shines a light on the reality of our world and offers us an alternative future. So, mission and ethical practice is always in the context of empire. It is this all-pervasive system of domination which governs social structures, interpersonal relationships, notions of race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, adults and children, religion and discipleship. It is a challenge to discern it because we live within it, but this is the slow process of walking in the footsteps of Jesus. In fact, I want to suggest a definition of mission in the light of these challenges. See what you make of it. Mission is social practice through which we continually discern and seek to fulfill God's renewing purposes for all creation, as demonstrated by the way of Jesus in the shadow of engaging with and transforming the social practices of empire. I'll give you a moment to read it again. Of course, this relies on a number of assumptions. First, that mission is best understood in terms of the MISSIO Dei, the mission of God. That is, that mission is first of all God's nature and God's concern, before it is the church's or mine. God is missional. God has purposes for creation, which can be summarized as the reconciliation of all things, or the kingdom of God on earth as in heaven, or of course, the empire of God on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, God has a vision, and God is at work in pursuit of that vision, working for the healing of the nations, justice for the poor, peace between all peoples, and that we might know God and live in life, and life in abundance. Secondly, though, God calls us to join in. And to help us understand what this means, God gives us parables, which Jesus told, parables of the alternative empire, the kingdom, which are particularly worthy of note because they do indeed show us that this alternative realm is alternative. It is different from the norms of empire, because this kingdom is glimpsed in seeds, mustard seeds, seeds of a wild bush which was regarded as a bit of a nuisance, and yet when it grows, it becomes home to strangers, outsiders, birds of the air. And this kingdom is like buried treasure, hidden but precious. Not a great palace or impressive city, but underground, yet even so, worth giving ourselves to passionately. And it's like yeast, barely visible, imperceptible, and yet hugely transformative, mixed in with the dough of everyday life. And it's what we receive as children, like children, those at the bottom of society's pile, the little ones, the least, but also those who play and adventure, those who take risks, those who push at the boundaries, those who haven't yet been socialized fully into the ways of empire, those who ask why. What does this mean for mission and ethics? Well, a few things perhaps. Small things are significant. Small acts of kindness, defiance, justice, compassion, they all matter. Taking risks for a greater cause, playing by different rules, even under the nose of empire. These things are like seeds of an alternative reality. Offering hospitality to birds of the air, strangers and outsiders, even while the empire seeks to exclude. Here in these things we begin to see God's purposes and how to fulfill them. And the church is called to be a sign of these things, a foretaste of these things, an agent of these things. A sign by pointing towards them, towards these glimpses of God's empire, acknowledging that we are not this alternative reality in ourselves completely. We fall short of it, but we can point to it, even pointing to those other communities which also partially demonstrate it. Being gracious enough to celebrate where others are doing it, and helping people at large to discern it, to recognize it, to celebrate it, whoever is practicing it, whatever name they give to it, but affirming it as good news. And we are called to be a foretaste of it, to give people a flavour of this great feast, not claiming to be the whole thing, but audaciously affirming that we are charged with being it, even partially. So our relationships, our worship, our care for each other, how we do community with one another, these things should be yeast, seeds, treasure. So that when people encounter us, they encounter a glimpse of a community which differs from empire, and a community gracious enough with itself when it fails. And we're called to be an agent of this alternative empire, to work for it, to build partnerships in pursuit of it, furthering the case of justice, care for creation, the reconciliation of all things, and so transforming the terms of empire right under its nose, seeking to change its DNA, exposing wherever the system resists such hopefulness, such generosity of spirit, such rage in the face of injustice, such love in the face of fear. But to be a sign, to discern and declare God's alternative empire, is to evangelize and teach, but with a difference. Because to evangelize, to witness to God's good news, is to expose how the empire colonizes us, to seek to decolonize our consciousness, so that we see the good news in terms of the call to come out of empire. And this witness, this teaching, is demonstrated through building solidarity with all who are also alert to the conditioning of empire. It may not be a tribal evangelism, inviting people to join one group, but a call to see how empire divides and rules, how it damages us and causes us to damage the earth. It is a call to alertness. God's alternative empire is a space in which reconciliation between all peoples at one with the earth is possible. And to be a foretaste of it, a glimpse of it in our corporate life as churches, is to celebrate this alternative empire in our worship, where our desires are reoriented, so we learn not to love the empire, but to love God's alternative purposes. which are religious but also political, economic, ecological. So the priorities of our communities shift, and we attend to the least in our midst, and we attend to the big picture around us. And to be an agent, to work concertedly for this new realm, is to pursue justice in the face of racial injustice, justice in the face of gender injustice, justice in the face of economic injustice, peace in the face of violence and prejudice and exploitation of the earth. It is to treasure our common home, our great big neighbour, and to encourage neighbourliness, and to be encouraged by others to be neighbourly. This is what I mean when I speak of mission as social practice, through which we continually discern and seek to fulfill God's purposes for all creation, as demonstrated by the way of Jesus, in the shadow of, engaging with, and transforming the social practice of empire. A comprehensive challenge rooted in the dynamic graciousness of God, an anti-imperial dynamic which forgives us and empowers us until God's alternative kingdom comes on earth as in heaven.